History remembers the names of those who changed the world, yet it sometimes forgets the true cost of these transformations. It paints myths of solitary geniuses and sudden epiphanies. But reality is always more complex. It is fraught with struggle, compromise, injustice, and an irony that bears no resemblance to fate. In the early 19th century, in the heart of London, lived Thomas Hodgkin. He was a physician, a pathologist, devoted to science and to people. He sought answers where others saw only hopelessness, and he found them. He was the first to describe a disease later named lymphoma, a deadly cancer of the lymphatic system. This was a revolutionary discovery that saved millions of lives. But Hodgkin didn't just discover diseases. He changed the destinies of entire peoples. He became one of the key architects of one of history's most unusual and tragic experiments, the creation of the state of Liberia, a homeland for former slaves. So he was an outstanding physician and scientist. He made one of the greatest discoveries in medicine. He witnessed and participated in the birth of a new nation. And what happens to great minds happened to him. His name faded into obscurity. His contributions were disputed, and his grand project turned into a tragedy. We tend to think of scientific discoveries as pure and pristine flashes of genius, born in sterile laboratories, authored by flawless heroes. This is untrue. Every great discovery is not just a scientific breakthrough. It is a tangle of human ambition, political intrigue, personal tragedies, and societal upheavals. It is a struggle for recognition, for power, for truth itself. And the story of Thomas Hodgkin is a vivid testament to this. To understand him, to understand his era, we must delve into a world where medicine clashed with prejudice and noble intentions faced harsh reality. Imagine that world, a world where a simple cough could herald the end. Where science was merely a collection of scattered observations, not a system of knowledge. Where the human body remained a mystery and illness was seen as divine punishment. Before the early 19th century, medicine was in deep stagnation. For centuries it relied on the dogmas of the ancient Greeks, on the teachings of Galen, which no one dared to challenge. Physicians were more philosophers than practitioners. They studied Latin and Greek, debating the balance of mythical humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Yet they rarely dared to dissect corpses to study anatomy. Knowledge was theoretical, not empirical. When illness struck, the arsenal of remedies was limited and often fatal. Bloodletting was considered a panacea for all ailments, from fever to depression. Patients were bled to exhaustion, to the point of fainting, believing this would rid them of bad humors. Surgery was barbaric. Operations were performed on conscious patients without anesthesia. The pain was unbearable, and many died from shock or blood loss still on the table. Wounds after amputations were cauterized with hot irons or doused with boiling oil to stop bleeding and cleanse damaged tissues. This caused terrible suffering and almost always led to gangrene. Pus draining from wounds was not seen as a sign of deadly infection, but as a laudable symptom, proof that the body was expelling the disease. No one knew about microbes. Instruments were not sterilized. Doctors' hands, fresh from dissecting a corpse, could immediately touch an open wound on a living patient. Hospitals were not places of healing, but breeding grounds for death. Overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and lack of ventilation turned them into hotbeds of plague, smallpox, cholera, and tuberculosis. Infant mortality reached 50%. Any infection, even the simplest, could be a death sentence. It was a world where human life hung by a thread, and the hope of healing seemed a naive dream. It was into this world, where the human body remained a mystery, and medicine was a craft based on dogma, that Thomas Hodgkin arrived. He was born in 1798 in London, into a Quaker family. This was more than just a religious movement, it was a way of life founded on strict principles. Quakers advocated for the equality of all people, for peace, for education, and for active service to society. These values shaped Hodgkin. They taught him to view the world impartially, to seek justice and compassion even where others saw only an anonymous mass. Young Hodgkin chose medicine. He enrolled in the famous Guy's Hospital in London, one of Britain's largest and oldest medical institutions. Here he confronted a harsh reality. Daily he saw hundreds of patients. He watched them suffer from bloodletting, witnessed their wounds being cauterized, and saw them die from the simplest infections. He observed the helplessness and confusion of his mentors, who blindly adhered to outdated treatises. What he learned from books utterly contradicted what he saw with his own eyes. He was taught about the four humors, about the balance of fluids in the body. But on the dissection table he saw not abstract humors, but diseased organs. He saw pus that was not laudable, but mortally dangerous. He saw patients who underwent bloodletting become weaker, not stronger. He saw how surgical interventions, meant to save lives, more often killed. Hodgkin was not merely a student, he was an observer. He was methodical and meticulous. He began to question the very foundation of medical knowledge of the time. He didn't take anything on faith. He demanded evidence. Every autopsy, every case of illness became for him not a confirmation of dogma, but a challenge. He sought not what should be according to books, but what actually was. His inquisitive mind could not reconcile itself with ignorance cloaked in centuries of authority. He believed in empirical knowledge, in data obtained from direct experience, and this was the first step towards a revolution in medicine. Thomas Hodgkin didn't just study, he worked. Within the walls of Guy's Hospital, he quickly established himself as one of the most meticulous and gifted pathologists. He was appointed curator of the hospital's museum, keeper of thousands of human specimens. Every day he spent in the dissection room, where he autopsied the bodies of the deceased, carefully documenting every anomaly, every diseased organ. It was routine, but for Hodgkin it became an endless experiment, a search for patterns where others saw only the chaos of decay. He collected, classified, and sketched. His notebooks were filled with tiny handwriting, detailed anatomical diagrams, and tissue descriptions. He saw hundreds, thousands of cases. But one day, in 1826, he encountered something unusual. It was the case of a young man who died with an unexplained, severe enlargement of the lymph nodes and spleen. Hodgkin had seen similar symptoms in other patients, but couldn't find an explanation in old medical treatises. He felt this was something different, a distinct disease, not merely a complication. He began his investigation with his characteristic thoroughness. He needed to meticulously prepare samples for study and preservation in the museum. For this, he used a special expensive compound, a kind of fixing oil, which permeated the tissues, making them suitable for long-term storage and detailed microscopic analysis. But precisely at this critical moment, as he worked on this unique case, his supply of this oil ran out. All further work was jeopardized. An ordinary doctor would have postponed the research, awaiting a new supply. But Hodgkin couldn't wait. He saw something before him that demanded immediate study. He made a decision to conduct an experiment. Abandoning the usual fixing compound, he altered his method. He began working with the freshest, unprocessed tissues, relying on his keen eyesight, tactile sensations, and the slightest changes in density and structure. He compared them with samples that had already been fixed, searching for subtle but recurring signs. He sectioned the nodes at various angles, examined them against the light, and palpated them, trying to understand their internal architecture. It was at this moment, under the forced abandonment of familiar tools, that the truth revealed itself to him. He saw not merely enlarged, but specifically altered lymph nodes, dense, elastic, with a characteristic cross-section. He noticed that the affliction was systemic, affecting not only the nodes, but also the spleen, and sometimes other organs. This was not inflammation, not tuberculosis, not syphilis. This was something new. He observed this pattern not in one, but in a series of 6 similar cases, which he described in detail in his work. For the first time in medical history, Thomas Hodgkin identified a distinct, previously unknown disease. He named it lymphadenosis, but the world remembered it as Hodgkin's disease, or lymphoma. This was not just a set of symptoms, it was a clearly defined nosological entity, opening the way to understanding and then to treatment. Hodgkin's discovery was not an accident. It was a consequence of his approach, an approach that rejected blind authority and demanded empirical evidence. This was more than just scientific intuition, it was a meticulous, methodical intellectual endeavor. His Quaker roots, his principles of equality, and the pursuit of truth also manifested in his science. He did not divide patients into worthy and unworthy. He saw every person as an object for study, a source of data. He did not accept others' conclusions. He trusted only what he saw himself. He believed in experience. He believed in facts. Hodgkin didn't just look at dissected bodies. He saw, he compared, he documented. Each case wasn't just a death, it was data. Each autopsy was a lesson. He knew that the truth wasn't in ancient books, but in the tissues, in the organs, in the pathological changes he observed. His laboratory was the dissection room. His textbooks were the bodies of the deceased. When his supply of fixing oil ran out, it didn't become an obstacle. It became a catalyst for innovation. He didn't wait for a new supply. He didn't postpone his work. He changed his method. Instead of processed samples, he began working with the freshest, unprocessed tissues. This was risky. It required immense precision. He relied on his keen eyesight and tactile sensations. He sectioned the nodes at various angles, examined them against the light, and palpated them, trying to understand their internal structure. This forced abandonment of familiar tools made him even more perceptive. He developed a new sensitivity to changes in tissues that others simply didn't notice. He didn't just discover, he shared knowledge. He understood that a discovery is useless if it remains unknown. He published his works in his native language, English. This was a challenge to a centuries-old tradition where Latin was the language of science, accessible only to a select few. Hodgkin wanted his discoveries to be understandable to a wide range of physicians so they could apply them in practice. He meticulously documented his observations, created detailed sketches, and systematized data. His notebooks became his primary tools, as vital as his scalpel. He was not afraid to admit his mistakes. He did not cling to old dogmas. He constantly learned from every case, every autopsy, every difficulty. He didn't seek confirmation for his theories, he sought the truth. And this thirst for truth, this empirical approach, this commitment to accuracy and accessibility became the foundation of new medicine. It was a world where diagnoses were based on facts, not humors. When Hodgkin published his observations, when he openly declared that the truth lay not in ancient treatises but on the dissection table, it was more than just a scientific breakthrough. It was a direct insult, a challenge to centuries of established order. The medical establishment, entrenched in its elitism, could not forgive him such audacity. Professors who had lectured on Galen for decades, doctors who had bled patients for decades, felt threatened. Their authority, their knowledge, their place in the hierarchy, all of it was shaken. They accused him of ignorance, of lacking a fundamental education. They said he was merely a craftsman, a pathologist rummaging through cadavers, not a true healer or philosopher. His empirical method, his attention to minute details, seemed like profanation to them. Where is the theoretical basis? Where is the logic of humors? They demanded. His works in English, accessible not only to a narrow circle of Latinists, were perceived as populism, an attempt to simplify science and reduce it to the level of commoners. Attempts to discredit him were widespread. He was denied publication in reputable journals. His presentations at medical society meetings were met with cold silence or open censure. Some colleagues even tried to restrict his access to Guy's Hospital's anatomical collections and the dissection room, claiming his dirty methods desecrated the sanctity of knowledge. They saw him not as an innovator, but as a destroyer, undermining the foundations of their power and privilege. But Hodgkin was not alone. Behind him stood a few but influential patrons. They were among those who saw the real results of his work, who understood that medicine needed renewal, not an endless rehash of ancient dogmas. Among them was Benjamin Harrison, treasurer of Guy's Hospital, a man with a sharp mind and a pragmatic view of matters. He saw that it was precisely thanks to Hodgkin, thanks to his meticulous autopsies and accurate diagnoses, that the hospital began to understand the true causes of deaths. He protected Hodgkin from attacks, ensuring him resources and freedom for research. There were others too, young doctors who, inspired by his example, began keeping their own detailed records, comparing symptoms with autopsy results, seeking facts, not dogmas. They saw that Hodgkin wasn't just rummaging through cadavers. He was building the foundation of the future. He was naming diseases that were once nameless sufferings. He was paving the way to saving lives. And this was undeniable. Thus, at the very heart of the medical community, an unseen war unfolded. A war between past and future, between authority and evidence, between blind faith and empirical knowledge. Thomas Hodgkin found himself at its forefront. His name became a banner for some and a symbol of dangerous destruction for others. He was more than just a doctor. He was a battlefield where the fate of all medicine was being decided. However, in this unseen war, where every diagnosis became an act of resistance and every autopsy a manifesto, victory doesn't always resemble a loud battle. For Thomas Hodgkin, it manifested differently. It appeared in recognition that could not be denied him, in the authority he was granted. In 1825, even before publishing his seminal observations on lymphoma, Thomas Hodgkin was appointed not merely curator of Guy's Hospital Museum, but also lecturer in morbid anatomy. This was more than just a post, it was a triumph. Not over external opposition, but over the internal resistance of the system itself. It was a direct consequence of his tireless work, his uncompromising methodical approach, his ability to see what others ignored. Benjamin Harrison, the treasurer, a man who managed the hospital's finances and observed its operations from within, understood that the words of professors were one thing, but real results were quite another. He saw how Hodgkin's meticulous records and precise post-mortem diagnoses helped the hospital understand the true causes of epidemics and deaths. He saw that it was Hodgkin, not the dogmatists, who provided answers. It was Harrison, with his power and influence, who championed Hodgkin. He didn't just ensure his access to the dissection room and collections. He gave him a platform. He gave him the opportunity to teach. Being a lecturer in morbid anatomy meant more than just giving lectures. It meant shaping the minds of a new generation of doctors. It meant setting standards. It meant that his empirical method, his approach based on observation and facts, was now becoming part of official education. From that moment, the dissection room at Guy's Hospital transformed into a true laboratory, and the lecture halls into a forge of new thought. Hodgkin didn't just show students specimens. He taught them to see. He taught them to question. He taught them to trust their eyes, their hands, their logic, rather than outdated dogmas. He demanded from them the same things he demanded from himself: accuracy, meticulousness, impartiality. He taught them to systematize data, compare symptoms with pathological changes, and seek patterns. Young doctors, weary of the impotence of old medicine, eagerly absorbed his knowledge. They saw that his method worked. They saw that it provided answers. They began to emulate his approach, keeping their own detailed records and building their own collections. They became his followers, his army, slowly but surely changing the landscape of medicine from within. Of course, the old guard didn't surrender overnight. They continued to grumble, continued to criticize. But now their voices sounded weaker. Hodgkin gained his foothold. His authority now rested not only on his personal genius, but also on his official position, on his ability to teach, on the hundreds of students who passed through his lectures. He was no longer an outcast. He was a beacon. He was an architect who built the foundation of new medicine, brick by brick, based on facts, not myths. What did this new knowledge bring? Practical changes. The dissection room was no longer just a place for autopsies, it became the first line of defense. Bloodletting, considered a panacea for centuries, began to lose ground. Doctors, armed with precise descriptions of pathologies, started to realize its futility and often its harm. This was not an instantaneous abandonment, but the beginning of the end for an era when treatments killed more often than the disease itself. With the advent of clearly defined nosological entities, such as lymphoma, medicine gained the ability to differentiate diseases. This was critically important. A patient was no longer merely sick with enlarged glands or suffering from humors. They received a specific diagnosis. And a diagnosis is the first, most crucial step toward meaningful treatment. Without an accurate diagnosis, there could be no research, no therapy, and certainly no survival statistics. It cannot be said that mortality from lymphoma dropped overnight. This was impossible in a world without antibiotics and chemotherapy. But a path emerged. A goal appeared. Institutional changes were no less profound. Hodgkin's lectures on morbid anatomy became the core of new medical education at Guy's Hospital. Students, future doctors, no longer just listened to lectures about humors. They studied tissue samples, learned to perform autopsies, and systematized observations. Medical education became less theoretical and more practical, based on empiricism. Doctors emerging from these walls were a different generation. They did not fear the scalpel. They did not shun the dissection table. They sought causes, not merely symptoms. Within the hospitals themselves, the approach to patient record-keeping changed. Under Hodgkin's influence, doctors began to keep more detailed, systematic records. They described not only symptoms, but also the results of autopsies, comparing them. This led to the creation of the first comprehensive medical archives. These were not just scattered notes. They were databases that became the basis for further research and epidemiological analysis. This allowed them to see which diseases were prevalent, which treatments were effective, and which were not. For the first time, hospitals began collecting information that could save lives. This was a huge step from chaos to system. Hodgkin's discovery didn't just add a new disease to textbooks. It changed the very way of thinking in medicine. It shifted medicine from the realm of philosophical conjecture to that of precise, measurable facts. This was the foundation for all modern evidence-based medicine. It was the first brick in the edifice where diagnoses are based not on ancient myths, but on data, on test results, on what is visible under a microscope. It was a world where truth lay not in books, but in the human body. Thomas Hodgkin. He gave medicine the path to saving millions by discovering a deadly disease. He tried to build a home for former slaves, creating an entire state. In one, he was a genius whose discovery changed the future. In the other, he was the architect of a tragedy whose noble intention led to drama. His name remained in the designation of lymphoma, yet he himself faded into the shadows. His contributions were disputed, and his grand project turned into a bitter lesson. This is the paradox. The most profound changes do not always bring glory. They are born in struggle, their path is arduous, and their true cost and significance are revealed only centuries later. Hodgkin became a beacon for the future, but his own story is a reminder of how fragile memory is and how complex the price of progress can be.